Okay, I think we're connected. Just about time to start. Connected real easy today. It's a beautiful day here today. It is starting to turn towards fall. We're seeing some of the leaves starting to turn already. Greetings from Poland. Greetings from Michigan.
It's 6 o'clock.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so this evening I'm going to do another discourse on relationship between Buddhist understanding and the scientific understanding. And I want to focus today on a particular question of biology, which is morphogenesis. That is the unfolding of form. And I'm going to particularly reference the work of Rupert Sheldrake. He's a kind of maverick biologist who I find very interesting. I just typed his name into the chat so you get the correct spelling if you want to look him up. He's written numerous books, and he's got a bit of stuff online as well. He started his career, he's British, he started his career as an embryologist, studying how embryos unfold into the adult form. And he came to the realization that the existing paradigm doesn't explain it very well. According to the mainstream biological consensus, all the information of an organism is encoded in the DNA. And we now have advanced, since Sheldrake actually began his work, we've advanced quite a bit in genetic studies, and we've mapped the human genome. But what they understand quite a bit about the mechanism of how the genetic code works. but it seems that all the DNA does is code for proteins. And this is only the first stage in the unfolding of or the development of a living organism. It's wonderful and complicated and miraculous enough, this process. Once you get into the mechanics of it, it's incredibly intricate, this machinery of how proteins are created from simpler chemicals according to this code in the DNA. But once the protein is synthesized, then the first thing it does is to fold itself, and it only works for the function it's designed for if it's folded correctly into the right three-dimensional shape. So this is the first mystery, is how they manage to correctly fold themselves. Then in the case of a embryo, it begins with a fertilized egg that has the DNA from both parents, and for the first few cell divisions, the cells are identical. This is what they call stem cells. And then they start to differentiate. So you get some cells that will develop into skin, some into bones, some into blood, some into the liver, the brain, and so on. But they all have the same DNA. They all have the same code. So this is the next mystery, how this differentiation occurs. And then they find themselves grouping together and forming organs and higher level structures, which again are incredibly intricate. You consider all the blood vessels and the nerves that flow through the body. And how does the embryo, where does the embryo get the information to do this? It doesn't seem to be sufficient. There doesn't seem to be sufficient information in the DNA as a blueprint for such a complicated structure and such an intricate, fine-grained, detailed structure. And in every single cell, there's a great deal of internal machinery, internal structures. And the more we know about it, the more we find out about it, the more intricate and complex it appears to be. So Sheldrake suggested that there had to be another source of information besides the DNA. And since no physical coding of information can be found other than the DNA, he postulated that there must be a non-physical repository of information that he calls morphogenetic fields. And this is where mainstream science goes tilt. They don't like this. It sounds kind of metaphysical. What he's proposing is that these fields are pure information fields. They have no physical form. They're non-local, meaning they're not locatable in space. They're simply pure information. And these fields exist in a nested hierarchy, control the development of all kinds of beings, of animals and plants, and even non-sentient objects like crystals, he says, have a morphogenetic field. So when I say a nested hierarchy, there'll be some minor field that controls the shape of the nervous system, and there'll be a higher level field that controls the or guides the shaping of the entire organism, and there'll be a higher level field that governs the common features of all mammals, say, and then a higher level field that governs all animals. And these are kind of like blueprints, but pure information. They can be compared somewhat to Plato's. This is a reversion to Plato's idea of the ideal forms, but they're not the same, because in Plato's system, there is an ideal archetype for each form. So there's an ideal man, an ideal horse, and so on. And the living actual organisms are imperfect duplicates or copies of the perfect form. Whereas Rupert Sheldrake's fields are not perfect. They're not ideal archetypes. They're in a symbiotic relationship with the organic forms, and they co-evolve with them. So information goes back and forth, and the field is affected by what the organic forms do, and the organic forms unfold according to the information in the field. So one of the effects of this is on memory and the mind. And Sheldrake mentions in one of his writings an experiment that was done in the 1930s in Britain, and they were studying the ability of rats to learn how to navigate through a maze to get a piece of cheese. And they plotted on a graph how long it took the rats to figure out the maze. And they did this with hundreds of rats and took averages and measures, and learned quite a bit about the learning process in rats. Then 30 years later, in America, California, I think it was, there was a university that repeated the study, but they did it exactly as laid out by the British experimenters 30 years before, but they found the results quite different. The rats learned their way through the maze much quicker. They had a much steeper learning curve. They immediately got in after a few false starts, they figured it out very quickly. But when they changed the maze and did the same experiment with another batch of rats, but with a different maze, a new maze, then they duplicated their original results from the 1930s. So Rupert Sheldrake's explanation of this is that the map of the maze was fed into the morphogenetic field for the rats. And the rats did not have to have any physical connection. They did not have to be descended from the original rats or in contact with the original rats, but that memory was recoverable by them. And he's been doing experiments to try and verify this. For example, one of his ongoing experiments is to have groups of volunteers solve the Sunday Times crossword puzzle. And he has one group do it in the morning and another group do it in the evening, and finding that the people who do it in the evening do it much faster, because by that time there's been tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people have already done the crossword puzzle. So it's somewhat into the morphogenetic field. This would also account for things like the 100th monkey syndrome. I remember an episode in the city of Toronto in Canada, where the city started a program of municipal recycling, and they spent, I don't know, some very large sum of money researching a raccoon-proof bin for the recycling. Because Toronto has a huge population of feral raccoons. They're quite a nuisance. And they distributed these bins to the householders, and it took the raccoons about 3 weeks to figure out how to open the bins. And what was interesting, as soon as a few raccoons here and there figured it out, within a couple of days, they all knew how to do it. And I'm not sure, this was some years ago, and I haven't been back to Toronto for quite a few years, but last time I was in Toronto driving around, you could see people had put chains and bungee cords and ropes and whatnot around their bins to try and keep the raccoons out. But there's this kind of collective operation in the field. Something is fed into the field and it's accessible to all the organisms that are subordinate to that field. And this works in physical form with evolution over time. The evolution of forms as species evolve and change and diversify. The field is evolving, co-evolving with them, and providing new templates for new forms. So that's a pretty brief introduction to Sheldrake. And if anyone is interested, he's written a number of books. I think his first book, or the first book where he lays out this theory, is called New Science of Life. And he's developed quite a bit since then. And some of that book may be a bit dated because it was written before the mapping of the human genome, for example. But that's the book to read to get his basic theory. So that's one explanation for the unfolding of forms. And if we turn now to the Buddhist Paticcasamuppada, the dependent arising, we have the sequence from ignorance, karmic formations, from karmic formations, consciousness, from consciousness, name and form, Namarupa, from name and form, the six sense bases. That's the first few steps of the dependent origination. And what's of interest here is that this is because of consciousness, name and form, and consciousness is identified in the text, in the sutta actually, not yet the commentary, but right in the sutta is identified as rebirth linking consciousness, patisandhi vijnana. So it's the arising of mind in association with matter, with the fertilized egg, that allows the unfoldment of the embryo, name and form, which is the mental and physical organism. Elsewhere in the suttas, the beginning of life is described as the three elements coming together. That is the seed of the father, the blood of the mother. Of course, they didn't have the knowledge of the female mammalian egg, but So it's expressed this way: the blood of the mother and the Gandhava seeking rebirth, which is the consciousness of a previous being. So it's not just sperm and egg. There's not only two factors, there's a third factor, which is mind. And without mind being present, the embryo does not unfold. It doesn't develop. So Sheldrake's information fields sound a lot like mind, considered in the abstract. That there is in physical form, there is a guiding principle that's non-physical. And we saw last week when I talked about quantum mechanics, the idea of the observer collapsing the wave function. And something similar is going on here. And this is where these kind of questions are where the materialist paradigm breaks down. Because there is no good, purely materialist or physicalist explanation of how an embryo unfolds. It's still a mystery according to mainstream science, which is still largely beholden to a materialist worldview. And I think this is stronger. The materialism is, I think, stronger in biology than it is in physics. I think a lot of the physicists have gotten past that, but there's still a mechanistic and materialist bias in biology. And that's why Sheldrake is kind of considered a heretic. For example, he gave a TED talk, and there was such an outrage from the mainstream biologists. How can you let this heretic on? That they took the talk down. Yeah, you can still find it on the internet and archived, but you won't find it in the library of the TED Talks. So he was, he independently came upon the idea that there's a non-physical component to physical form. He didn't call it mind, he called it morphogenetic fields, but he does call it a pure information field, which comes very close to the conception of mind as a non-physical component. And mind in the abstract in Buddhism is also, it's non-physical and it's also non-local. You have in the Buddhist cosmology, you have a class of beings that are mind only, the formless realm, the arupa realm, and they're pure mind without any physical form, and it's explicitly stated that they cannot be located in space. They're neither here nor there nor nowhere nor anywhere. The concept of space just doesn't apply to them, so they're non-local. Just as the Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields are non-local, pure information. So the mind as Patisandhi Vijnana, the rebirth linking consciousness in the dependent origination, is necessary for the unfolding of the organism. And Kama is also taken into account. The arising of forms is according to the Kama of the being, which means past actions. And Kama itself is properly considered a mental factor. It's non-physical, but it does strongly guide the unfoldment of a being. And of course, the mental factor operates in association and in tandem with the physical structure of the organism. And the DNA code is the physical information repository that contains the recipe for all the proteins that make up the body of the organism. And proteins being the building blocks of everything, in the cells and structures that support the life of a being. And there are hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of proteins, and they're all very intricately shaped and very precisely coded in the DNA. But where they go and what they do and how they create larger scale structures is not well explained simply by the DNA. Without that non-physical component, it's really impossible to understand how this intricate structure of a living organism, something as complicated as a human being, how this comes to be. It's a principle of Buddhist philosophy that the underlying principle of dependent origination is that nothing arises without a cause, and nothing arises from a single cause. So there's no randomness, and there's also no simple monocausality. So to explain where the information comes from in a human being, we have to take into account the DNA, the previous karma of that being, and the mental guiding factor, that pure information. And when you get into the more you get into the details of how a biological organism works, the more remarkable and impossible it seems to be that such a thing could have formed in a purely mechanistic way. All this intricate machinery. If you get, just to take one example, if you get into the mechanics of how a protein is made, the DNA has the recipe, and it's transferred to the messenger RNA, and that takes it out into the cell, and the transfer RNA works with the ribosome and 20 different proteins to assemble the amino acids in the correct order. So there's all these components, and I'm simplifying it quite a bit. It's extremely intricate machinery at the very tiniest beginning level of an organism. To make a single protein, you require all this machinery to be operating and energized by molecules from the mitochondria. So all this has to work together, and somehow it all happens. It's all coordinated, and everything goes along in the right sequence and in the right place, and the protein is strung out from the ribosome, and then it folds itself into the correct shape, to the correct three-dimensional shape, so it can serve as whatever function it has been designed for. So it seems to me obvious that there has to be some other factor than simply mechanistic laws of chemistry and physics going on here. There has to be some additional factor, and whether you call it mind or morphogenetic field is really just a semantic difference. Okay, so I'll leave it at that for today's talk, and next week I want to do one more on when a biological theme. I thought I would like to talk about the origins of life. So let's see what we got in the chat. In the UK, there was a phase where birds all over the country were pecking through the seals of milk bottles and drinking the cream off the top. Yeah, I think that particular one is cited by Sheldrake. The information or imprint for being is stored in the ganda, but no, it's not really stored anywhere. It's non-local. The Gandhaba is just a name for the re-arising consciousness. And it's the presence of that consciousness that allows access to the information that Sheldrake would call the morphogenetic field. Venerable Ajahn, on the Alaya Winyana, you said recently it could be a field of information beyond space and time. Is that operative here? Yes, I think so. Alaya Winyana is a concept from Yogacara school. It's not a Theravada concept, but there's it's sometimes called the seed consciousness or the storehouse consciousness, and it in its essence, it sounds very much like this morphogenetic field, that there's a kind of non-local, purely mental storehouse of information. The issue being transfer of information from non-time space to time space determined entity. Yes, that's basically what happens. It's there is a relationship between mind and matter. They're not the same thing, but they affect one another. Is nibbana outside of materiality? Yes, definitely. Perhaps logically, if a birth, whether fortunate or unfortunate, is a result of karma, is it likely that Namarupa and life consciousness are incorporated in the code that we are unable to identify, in a code that we are unable to identify? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if one way or the other whether we can really call karma a code. I suppose it is in the broadest sense, that there is and there's a repository of information. Do you think that a plant growing from seed requires at least a kind of mind or field or something? Yeah, it would have to have it would have to have some kind of field. Whether it's conscious or not is a question. It is in the Abhidhamma theory. Plants are considered to not have consciousness. They're said to have life faculty only. So life faculty could be, another type of field. Can you say a bit more about information not being local or temporal? Yeah, information is a completely abstract concept. When you have, say, you have a bunch of words typed onto a piece of paper, then you have that physical form of the paper, but the information that is encoded in those words could also be spoken out loud, or could be chiseled in rock, or translated into Greek, but the information is an abstract that then can take a physical form of expression, so beings can access it. But the information itself is non-local. It doesn't have a particular locality. It's a purely mental thing. Then it can be expressed in a physical form. Consider something like a number, like say the number 7, just as an abstract concept. Mathematics is a good model for this. Something that exists in a purely abstract, mental, non-physical, non-local way. Like, where is number 7? Now, you can have 7 objects, or you can write the digit 7 in the the Arabic numerals or in Roman numerals or whatever. But that's not the same thing as the abstract concept of 7. I would humbly recommend Beyond Darwin, the program hypothesis. I haven't heard of that one. That might be worth looking into. Does this morphogenetic field work only on the good stuff, like how to solve a maze or how to meditate, supporting solving stuff? Or does it also influence defilements like greed, support greed, etc.? Yeah, I would think it would. I don't think it's in itself has an ethical basis. It's just whatever's programmed into it. There would be, I think, over time, over a long enough stretch of time, it would tend to weed out really destructive behaviors and patterns, because those beings would die off and they would no longer be feeding it into the field. I just finished pruning the chokecherry at my mother's place on the prairies. This talk reminds me of communication among plants that may occur among mycorrhizae mycelia. May the day was within be well. Yeah, they're fine. I have come across that the network of mycelia under the soil acts like a kind of a nervous system, and the plants communicate with each other, at least to some extent, in terms of governing how they grow and share resources and so on. So information does not need a medium. No, not pure information. It can be. It's only when it's expressed through a medium is when we can access it. But it it exists as in the abstract. Yeah. The nibbana must be beyond the metamorphic field. Yes, I would say so. Environments have morphic fields, right? Is that why some places have good or bad atmosphere? A church or a forest will have a certain unique flavor. Yeah, that could be. There's all, and we don't really understand only a tiny fraction of reality. But it's common experience that places do have a certain atmosphere. Some places feel very peaceful, other places feel spooky. Often religious places, temples and churches, where people have been involved for long periods of time in spiritual practice, that I'm sure that creates a kind of a field that people can sense, that there's a feeling of sacredness in the place. It's not, and I don't think that originates so much in the place as in the accumulated energies of all the beings that have done practice there. Okay, so I think we're kind of slowing down now. So if this, I'll just wait a minute or two, see if there's any last question or two. Okay, so I'll take my leave and thank you for coming, and we'll see you again next week.